Hello everyone, and welcome to a different kind of video today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Shayla Vradenburgh, who is the founder, what would you call it, founder of Revolting Science Resources, and I'm going to let her explain what that is. But today, because I was trained in the UK and Shayla was trained in the US, we are going to talk in the UK versus US PhDs. So Shayla, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Dr. Shayla Vradenburgh. I am the founder of Revolting Science Resources, which is a company that's designed to bring the principles of project management to academic scientists and researchers. I realized while I was finishing up my PhD and afterwards, when I kind of learned a little more about project management, how vital it is to the work that we do as researchers. And so I created a company that's all about kind of ways that you can implement some of those principles in the work that you do.
And Shayla also gives presentations at conferences and at institutions. So, please consider bringing her in. She is great. I did see her present at the National Postdoctoral Association. So yeah, that's a bit about Shayla. You all know me because you're on my YouTube channel. I'm Kate. I'm the founder of EduKatedSTEM. And normally I talk about education and professional development. So this slots in beautifully because at the beginning of your career, you might be considering whether you should do a PhD and also maybe where you should do one. Because whether you're international, whether you're from the UK or the US, students come from each country all the time. And there are videos on YouTube already from various people explaining why they chose various countries or not. So I encourage you to look at those. But Shayla and I will be talking about our personal experiences and also the information that is relevant today, which is in May 2025, because we did do a little bit of researching around this area. So how about we talk about the application process? Do you want to go first, Shayla?
Yeah, so I will say it's been a few years since I've applied. I applied back in 2017, so it's again been a few years. But for that application process, most of the time it looks pretty similar for a lot of different universities. And also, what I'll say is I got my PhD in neuroscience, and in a lot of institutions in the U.S., that can be in kind of different places. For me, most of the places I applied, it was part of the School of Medicine, but sometimes you can have it be parts of different biology departments or the College of Arts and Sciences. And so sometimes things can vary based off of what department or school that you're applying to. For kind of mostly like these biomedical science, School of Medicine things, there's also sometimes umbrella programs. So some of the institutions I applied to, you actually apply to an umbrella program, and then you kind of select your specialization afterwards. On some of them will let you apply directly to a specialization. So some of those kind of nuances are a little different, but a lot of the time it requires some sort of cover letter or at least like personal statement, some sort of, like basically talking a little about the things you've accomplished in a CV, having letters of recommendation. And a lot of it is really predicated on how much research experience you have. They really want to see some tangible ways that you've actually gained some experience that's relevant to the work that you're hoping to do. And then there normally is an application fee. I know when I was applying, I actually went to a national conference called SACNAS. And while I was there, I actually was able to get a lot of waivers for different institutions so that I didn't actually have to pay that application fee. But that can be another thing that kind of adds up if you're applying to a lot of different institutions. And yeah, I think those were like most of the components for kind of applying. I think it honestly was a little similar when you're thinking about like applying for undergrad versus applying for grad school. I also know too, like sometimes the GRE or like the GMAT was a test you would take. I took the GRE. It was required when I applied, but I think about 2 years into my grad program, they actually got rid of that requirement at my institution and at a good number of institutions. So something though to keep in mind to definitely think about is whether or not that test might be something you need to include.
I will say that having sat on an admissions committee, how you do on the GRE or the GMAT does not indicate how well you do in graduate school, which is one of the reasons why we discussed dropping it, because you couldn't tell. It really didn't indicate your success or not. Okay, so the British system is different. You apply to a specific research project with a particular professor. So completely different. You have to find the listings, you find the research that you're interested in, and then you apply specifically to work for that individual. So, you know, we don't normally have rotations like you do in America, because you're specifically going for that particular project and professor, which is good and bad, because what happens if you don't like the professor? You're kind of stuck. That's it. But that also means that you know what your project is as soon as you come in. There's no surprise. You literally applied for it. And at least when I applied, which was a very long time ago, over 20 years ago, there was no application fee. You just sent your materials off, so CV and a cover letter, maybe a personal statement, and definitely your transcripts and letters of recommendation. You just sent those off. And so I can't remember how many I actually applied for, because there was no financial component. So I could have applied for every single one I looked at. And then I definitely had a number of interviews, which were all quite different. So Shayla, do you want to talk about your experience for interviews?
Yeah, so I had a couple of interviews that I had scheduled. They looked pretty much the same though, where essentially you kind of start by meeting maybe some people for an informal sort of like dinner. You meet some of the grad students or even the faculty that are part of the program. Then the next day, it was normally kind of like a full day. You would do interviews with different faculty members. A lot of the time, they'd give you the option of people you could select, or you can request specific faculty members to meet with. And then they kind of have different grad students or people kind of walk you between all these different faculty interviews. And then there normally was some sort of a panel interview as well. So you would meet with, most of the time it was mostly faculty with a couple of graduate student representatives. And then essentially you do a panel interview as well, and kind of just answer lots of questions about your research, talk about their research. And I think what's also so valuable about this interview process is that it's not only an opportunity for, you know, these institutions to get to know you and why you might be a good fit, but you can also take that opportunity to get to know them and see how kind of the grad students seem to be in this kind of environment, or how they seem to support them, and how you might fit in that space as well.
That's a great point. You're interviewing them at the same time, because it's a huge commitment. And if you choose the wrong school or the wrong program, then you might not enjoy the experience. You might decide to leave the program, which would be terribly sad. So for my interviews, I had to give a scientific presentation at some of them, which was incredibly intimidating. I did that for Oxford. And then there's multiple interviews with different professors. Even if you're not wanting to work for them, you still get interviewed by multiple people. And I definitely had a panel interview for the PhD program I ended up going to. I had a panel, and it was actually really interesting, because there were 4 professors for 4 different proposals. And the professor that I interviewed for, I actually am very glad he didn't choose me and I didn't get the project. But someone else didn't like any of his candidates, but he liked me. But because we'd all interviewed together, he offered me a position. So yay for the panel.
Yes. And also, I guess I'm curious, for the presentation you had to give, was that like a slideshow? I know sometimes they even do like kind of chalkboard.
No,
kind of like,
full PowerPoint presentation.
like an hour long?
It wasn't a gosh, no, it wasn't an hour. Maybe 10, 15 minutes. And luckily it was because I had previously done research in America. So I presented on that research. But yes, everyone who was being considered for that particular program, we all had to give PowerPoint presentations. So I assume all of us had previous research experience. Otherwise, what would you have presented on?
Yeah, I was wondering that too. It's like, hopefully you have
Yeah, similar to what you said about people in, like, if you've done previous research experience. So in America, having those summer internships are really important if you want to move ahead into a PhD program.
Yeah, for sure. I did a summer research program at the University of New Mexico, and I think that was one of the most kind of transformative things I could have done, I think, for my career. I think it was just a really hands-on time. I got to spend literally a whole summer just focusing on research, working in a different place, working with different lab members, figuring out different techniques. And then I got to present that work ultimately too at places like SACNAS, which also kind of helped just broaden my range of contacts and different people within kind of different areas of the world. So yeah, I would highly recommend for anybody who, especially as an undergrad, and is thinking about research, like take a summer. There's so many of these different programs, and a lot of the times they pay you stipends to participate. So yeah, I think it's an incredible experience. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did a sandwich undergraduate, which meant that for my third year, my junior year, I had to leave and go and have a proper research job. So I could have gone and worked in a pharmaceutical company, but I was selected to come to the University of Virginia to do a year of cancer research, which is how I started off my cancer research kind of career, because I realized, oh, I can do that.
Yeah. That's
And
really
and then because that was on my CV, and at the time it was more unusual in the UK, because sandwich degrees, I don't know how popular they are now, but back then they weren't terribly popular. I mean, I got interviewed at the majority of the places that I applied for.
yeah. I mean, that sounds like an incredible opportunity.
That was good. Thank you, UVA. Okay, so I think one of the key things about the differences is the duration, because a British PhD is much shorter, right? So most people finish between 3 to 4 years. I actually submitted my PhD thesis or dissertation in under 3 years, which is unusual. But we get them through quicker. And we can talk about the reason for that in a moment. But Shayla, how long does an American one last?
Yeah, it can typically range somewhere between 5 to 7 years. I've seen people extend beyond that. I think most of the time when you would ask an institution what their average is, they'll probably say like 5.5 to 6. But yeah, that could definitely be a range. And I think especially after COVID, I think those numbers increased a little bit. But yeah, it's definitely a bit longer.
Yeah, I've known a couple of students who've taken 9. So
As have
if your professor is willing to keep paying you, then you just kind of hang around, which is also not necessarily a good thing, because you want to get out and do a postdoc or move on to the next step of your career.
Yeah, I think that's something too people don't talk a lot about is, you generally don't make a lot with these PhD stipends.
Really? You make noodles of money, Shayla.
I mean, you're right. What am I talking about? But I think if you think about how long this is, like 5 to 7 years, that's a long time to be making not the most amount of money. And then especially if the next step is a postdoc, which they are generally underpaid as well. It's going to take a lot longer before you're actually making a salary that kind of helps support your life, and especially the experience that you have.
Let's talk money. So back 20 years ago, I got paid £12,000 per year to do my PhD, which at the time was a very well-funded PhD, and unusually, and tell me how you got paid, Shayla. I got paid every 3 months.
Interesting.
So I had to budget really well for those 3 months.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, for me, so my PhD was not terribly long ago. We actually saw, I think, 2 increases during the time I was doing my PhD, but I started at 30,500. And that honestly isn't like, I think that is a generally well-funded PhD. I think Charlotte School is a little bit of a pricier area, but honestly, I didn't have a problem living with that stipend. We saw a couple of increases. So I think by the time I finished, I think it ended up around 33,500, somewhere around there. I think you asked me another question though, and I forgot it.
No, I just realized, did I just say I did my research at UVA? I did it at VCU.
Oh yeah. Oh, so you did it at VCU.
Wait, I just said the wrong university.
I was like, I didn't know that you went to UVA.
But... No, I've visited UVA. No, I was in Richmond.
Okay, that's close.
VCU.
It is really close.
I was like, it had Virginia in the title, but that is so wrong. Amnesia.
I was like, I feel like why did we not talk about this before?
No, it was a VCU. I was at the Massey Cancer Center for the Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm going crazy at the grand old age of 45. When you said UV, I was like, wait, I didn't go to Charlottesville. I am going nuts. I'm sorry, Shayla.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, so that's how much you got paid. So how much were you making at the end? Because you started at 30.
Yeah, I think it ended up around, I feel like it was 33, but there's a chance it was 35. One of those 2 numbers.
Okay, so it went up a decent amount though in a couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, it took me 6 years to complete my PhD. So over the course of 6 years, that's how much we went up.
Okay, so a stipend currently in the UK, and this is for 2025 to 2026, you would probably make just under £21,000. And importantly, that stipend isn't taxed. So you get all of the money.
Yeah.
So
And yeah,
how much is an American one?
I actually don't know what the current numbers are. That's a good question. Let's see.
I put it in there.
There we go. I guess like 20 to 50K. Yeah. I was like, I don't know. I think too, it's so varying depending on where you live as well. Like I know that some, places, especially in pricier areas like California or New York, they might be able to give you a better stipend because your cost of living is going to be significantly more than someone maybe in Texas or Tennessee. So it is like probably a very wide range.
I think that also is to do with humanities versus STEM, because I wasn't necessarily looking just for STEM. So I think that might have incorporated some humanities, and they are unfortunately paid a lot less than STEM degrees.
Yes.
Don't know why.
And being part of the School of Medicine, I think we were some of the best paid grad students on the campus.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, unfortunately. But ours is also taxed. So most of the time, I think it sometimes can be a little confusing and maybe even frustrating about how the stipend works in America, because you generally don't get something like a W-2 that you can easily submit to pay your taxes. Nothing's withheld, so you need to withhold yourself and make sure that you're paying it properly. So it can be a little bit more to figure out and not as easy or convenient, but you do have to pay taxes on it.
Did your graduate school have like a presentation once a year to help you do your taxes? Because I know some schools do that.
No, and that would have been great. I know some do, and I think even mine has started to do things, but when we were starting, they literally had kind of like meetings that were basically like, we will not help you with your taxes. This is your responsibility. You guys figure it out. So I'm glad
they don't want to get sued.
Like, I don't know what the ultimate goal of that was, but I'm glad they're starting to incorporate it more.
Yeah, no, we definitely did it until we got told that we could get sued if they got given the wrong information. So we did it for a while, and then it stopped at the graduate school I was an associate dean for.
Yeah.
Okay, so another big thing is the fees that you pay. So in the UK, if you're a domestic student, you're going to pay just short of £5,000, and that's per year. If you're an international student, you are going to be paid significantly more, anywhere between £20,000 and £35,000. And then in addition to that, we have something called a bench fee or a research support fee. So that basically helps to pay for all of the things that you use in the lab, which could be anywhere between £1,000 to £10,000, and that's per year. And then obviously, if you get a scholarship or some kind of thing through your program, they might pay for a portion or all of that. So luckily for me, I had to pay zero, which is awesome. But some people do have to pay. So what are the fees in America?
Yeah, so we also have tuition, and I think there generally tends to be things like in-state versus out-of-state. And then obviously if you're an international student, what I will say is, at least in the School of Medicine and when I was in grad school, we got our tuition waived. So no one paid for tuition. We also got free health insurance. So it ended up being something that wasn't really a cost that came out of the stipend that we received. Generally though, how it would work is there's like a period in which the actual, like the School of Medicine paid for your stipend until you joined a lab. And then your PI would likely have to take over those tuition costs essentially from the school. So even though you aren't going to have to get it taken out of your, like actual stipend, somebody is likely paying for it in some way, or there might be waivers that exist for portions or all of your kind of schooling or training there. But yeah, I think it totally just kind of depends on the program. And again, like the School of Medicine got a lot of perks that other kind of departments and schools did not get. So I think in terms of fees and things like that, if you are at universities that aren't going to offer tuition waivers or are going to require you to pay for some of that. It could range anywhere from, like $6,000 to $11,000 for in-state, up to 25 plus for out-of-state or international students. So could be a big range.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to note that if you're out of state, that's the same fee you pay as an international student.
Yes.
Which to me is incredible, because, if you go from, I don't know, Texas to California, it almost feels like you should be paying less than someone who's coming from an international country. So that's a bargain, frankly, if you're going out of state. It's a little crazy. And then there is a difference between a public institution and a private institution. So did you want to say what the difference between those are?
In terms of the cost?
Well, the cost, but also like, what is the difference? Like if someone doesn't know the difference between a public institution and a private, so what is the difference
between them? Yeah, most of the time that's generally kind of how they're funded. So a lot of public institutions are going to be funded by state or even federal funds, whereas private institutions are generally not. They might still receive them in some capacity, but they generally don't have to follow some of the specific kind of guidelines or rules. They get a little bit more freedom sometimes in the ways that they're able to operate, and they generally aren't receiving those state or federal funds. But yeah, in terms of the cost, that generally makes those private institutions a lot more expensive. And so the public institutions tend to be a bit more affordable, especially when you're thinking about the tuition costs.
And the way that I think of a public institution is it's usually like the state schools. So like the University of California would be a public institution, or the University of Maryland or Virginia, or well, actually, is UVA, is that public?
Yes, but the one that always tricks me up is the University of Pennsylvania. That one is a private institution.
Oh, it is?
I'm pretty sure someone's going to come for me, but I'm pretty sure.
I didn't mention that one. So I know that if you're interested, if you've heard of the Ivy League, that's only for a small portion of the country, and it's only a few universities, but there's now lists for different categories. So there's now something called the Public Ivy League table, which comprises of universities across the whole of the country. Which is awesome. So if you want to go somewhere which you're still going to get a great education, but it's not going to cost the world, look up the public list of Ivy Leagues. And just to give you a hint, my favorite, the UCs, are all in there. So University of California, totally representing.
Yeah, I think too, both of the schools I attended, the University of Virginia and the University of Florida, I think have made the public Ivy list. But yeah.
So you can still get a great education and it not cost the world, which I think is something that people sometimes forget.
Yeah.
Just because you've got prestige doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to give you an amazing. Remember, it also depends on your professor and the people in the lab who are training you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I honestly didn't even know that you could get paid at one point for going to especially like a PhD program, especially a lot of the ones in the United States, they tend to at least give you some sort of a stipend. And a lot of the times they'll waive your tuition. So you don't even have to pay those fees, but you're able to get a good education. You're maybe not making a ton of money, but you are getting that degree from a great institution for not quite as much.
You're possibly getting more than the Brits. Although I guess we need to do the pound versus dollar
conversion. Yeah,
that would have been clever for me to do that, but I did not look into that. I guess it depends on the day, so I guess it doesn't matter.
True.
Okay, so should we talk about funding? Because at home in the UK, we have a number of different ways that you can get funded. A lot of them are different research councils, depending on your research focus. So a couple of them would be the Biotechnology and Bioscience Research Council, or the BBSRC. You also have the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, or the EPSRC, and then you can get private funding from like Cancer Research UK or someone else. So it depends. You might be able to apply for your own funding, but usually if your professor has put a position out there, they've got the funding for 3 years.
Yeah, so funding is a little different for a lot of the institutions in the US. So part of it is that your PI might have funding for a project you're working on initially. They might not, but they could still take you. And then on top of that, like, you can obviously apply for your own funding. They can apply for other funding for different projects that you work on. The largest funder, especially for biomedical research in the US, is the National Institutes of Health at the NIH. So most people have some sort of a grant from the NIH, at especially R1 or kind of like really high level research institutes in the US. Other options are places like the National Science Foundation or NSF, that funds a ton of people as well. There's also private funding. And then also there tends to be a lot of internal ways that you can basically get scholarships from your institution. So there's normally grants or foundations. They also do like training grants as well, especially kind of for those first couple years of your PhD, that you're able to apply for and get some funding for as well.
I will say scholarships are kind of fun. At our graduate school, we had a few competitions depending on what year you were in. And so first years could win, and that was due to their academic performance in courses. And then for later years, it might be on a research proposal that they've put in, and it was looked at similar to like a mini grant proposal where it got reviewed by a team, and then the winners won the scholarship. So look out for those if you are going to go to school, because having those on your CV will definitely help you in the future, because they are quite prestigious to win.
Yeah, definitely. And also at our institution, if you ever did get some of those bigger grants, especially from the NSF or the NIH, they actually would give you an extra bump in your stipend. So you got like a little extra bonus for getting awards like the F31. So yeah, those are other ways that you can even just make a little extra.
Yeah. Okay, so should we talk about the structure? Because they are quite different.
Yes. And I wonder too, I'm curious if this also plays into maybe some of the difference in the time frames.
Oh, it absolutely has to.
Yes. But yeah, so at least in kind of the biomedical sciences in particular, but most of the PhD programs, again, you're thinking about this in roughly the average of 5.5 to 6 years. And normally those first 2 years are going to be really heavy on a lot of different courses and other things that you need to take as requirements. For our institution, the way they did it was actually like you came in as like kind of a group and a cohort from all different, again, kind of disciplines underneath some sort of umbrella of biomedical sciences. We had to take a course all together that was called the core course. It was kind of just like ultimately like kind of the main things you need to know, but kind of what that looks like can vary so much between different institutions, like literally between every different program. There can be different requirements on what the courses look like. And then we had lots of the required courses like ethics or kind of also just like stats, data courses. But pretty much by the end of your second year, those were all done. There were very few courses you needed to take beyond that. And then you primarily focused on doing research. And then that also kind of broke things up as well in terms of like exams and ways that you kind of progress through the program. So it's like the first 2 years are kind of course heavy. Then roughly around your second year, you need to do a qualifying exam. And that's when you move from a PhD student to a PhD candidate if you pass. Those look also very different. So maybe that's something we can talk about too, is what all these kind of candidacy exams look like. But then you roughly do research for kind of the remainder of those 4-ish years. And then that ultimately ends with you defending your dissertation.
Okay, so the English system, the British system is quite different. So the way I look at it is because we specialize earlier. So I did an applied biochemistry and molecular biology undergraduate degree. So from the age of 18, that's all I did. So I covered biology, chemistry, maths, statistics. I didn't do any other language. I didn't do any humanities. It was pure science. And so we don't do any classes. We don't do any courses, presumably because we've covered more of it in our undergrad. And I can tell you that having had British students in the graduate school that I worked in, when they did their courses, they just felt that they were relearning the same information. They weren't stretched in any way. They, felt that it was utter nonsense, but they were forced to basically do it again, which they were very disappointed in. So we go straight in because you know what your project is. There's no rotations. You go in on day one, you start doing your literature review, learning your topic, and then get trained by the people in the lab on various techniques and other things. I had a meeting with someone from my university. It was actually in between my second and third year, but they'd essentially forgotten me. It's supposed to be done between the first and second year. But because I did my PhD and I wasn't on the university campus, I was at the medical research laboratory. So I was at a completely different place about 30 miles away. So eventually, when all of my friends who were the year below me were doing this, I was like, wait, am I supposed to do that? And so I contacted them and they were like, oh yeah, you are. So write a short paper. It was like, I don't know, 10, 15 pages on my research. And then I had to go in and meet with an internal professor. And we just had a conversation for like an hour on my research. And he asked me lots of questions. And it was actually really helpful because he ended up being my examiner. And because of that conversation, I knew that he wasn't going to ask me questions on the proteins that I was researching. He was going to ask me questions on the proteins that he was researching, which were somewhat in the same pathway, but I wasn't researching his proteins. So that definitely helped. And then at 3 years, I handed in my dissertation. And then a few months later, it takes a little longer in the UK to have your exam. And we call it, this is going to sound really funny, we always called it a Viva. But when I Googled it, because I have heard it called a Viva, and like we used to laugh at people going, Viva, that's wrong, it's a Viva. But according to Google, the technical term is a viva voce, which is Latin for oral exam.
That makes sense.
So Viva. I'm going to say Viva because that's what we always used to say, but maybe my Latin, which is a non-existent, is wrong.
It's understandable that maybe it's not quite polished.
Not really. But no, it was definitely a moment, but I'm very thankful for that mini exam, because without it, I wouldn't have known how to handle my proper one, because I literally spent weeks before my exam researching his proteins, which had nothing to do with mine.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
So yeah, so should we talk about what the defense looks like?
Yeah, so I guess too, I can like back up and talk a little about our qualifying exam. So that generally for most programs essentially looked like creating a specific aims page, and that's what you would send out to a committee that you assemble. And then basically they'd read that, and then you do a presentation where you walk through what you're planning to do for your dissertation project. I was in a program that decided to kind of change things up and do something different. So also, again, like things are so dependent on different departments and schools. I actually did, like after my second year, we wrote a review paper. And then that is actually what we did a presentation on, was essentially kind of the background of whatever our research project was. And then following our third year, we essentially had to do the specific aims page and talk about our actual research project, which people have mixed opinions about. And then again, that kind of at the end was that dissertation defense. The way also dissertations are written can vary so much between different disciplines, schools, universities, and the requirements that they have. UVA was very relaxed with their requirements for the dissertation. It was essentially you write kind of an introduction, you write conclusion, but you kind of just staple all of your papers and all the work that you've done kind of in between. And I don't know if anybody actually read my whole dissertation. So there was that. I don't think anybody did. You essentially give it out to your committee a bit before you actually defend, but I don't think a single person read the whole thing.
How long was it? Because I'm used to people waiting like a few weeks. So when they found out that I waited, like, I think mine was, because I handed mine in September and I didn't defend until towards the middle to the end of November. So that was definitely 2 months.
Yeah. I think generally it's recommended, to give like a couple weeks to a month beforehand to let your committee look at it. But honestly, I don't know how many of them actually take any of that time to read through it. So the actual defense, though, is generally split up between a private and a public defense. And that also can look really different depending on the institution that you're at. The way our university, like my department also, not even just everyone at UVA, but my department did it by first you do a private defense. And so it's just your committee, you do a presentation talking about everything that's basically in your dissertation. They grill you, ask you a bunch of questions. But then if they approve and they think that it kind of meets the standards, then you pass. and then you're pretty much set. Like the last requirement is to do a public defense, but if you've passed your private, you are guaranteed pretty much to pass at that point. And so then you do a public defense. That's when you can invite other people, friends, family, and then do a public defense. Basically the same presentation that you gave to your committee, you do again in public. Some kind of departments do them together. So it's like you'll first do this public defense where everybody comes, you do that presentation, and then you have the private defense but right after that, and then your whole committee just grills you on what you presented. But generally it looks like one of those two things. And I've heard that for most places, they generally don't even let you get to the point of scheduling that defense if they don't think that you're ready to pass it. So most people end up passing their dissertation defenses.
Yeah. Have you known anyone who got sent back and had to continue working or not?
Not for the dissertation defense. I have for the qualifying exam, but not for the dissertation defense, no.
Okay. So yeah, ours is definitely different. So I think it's because I was based at two different places, because I got my degree from a university but was based at a medical research council. So I gave a lecture or a presentation at the MRC, and then I went to my university and gave a seminar there, which was completely separate. So 2 completely different days. And then that was before the end of September. And then I had my defense in November, and my defense was just with 2 people. So I had one external examiner who was an expert in my field, and then I had the same internal examiner who I'd already met with, and therefore, prepared for. And normally we always got told that the external examiner is going to be the worst one, because they are the expert in your field. Mine wasn't. It was my internal, and that's purely because he just kept asking me questions related to his research, which was great. Thankfully, I had already prepared for that, but still it was a struggle. And then you can have a few different things can come out of that. You can pass with no corrections whatsoever, which is incredibly rare. You can pass with some corrections, or I have known people to either fail outright or be sent back to either do more research or to rewrite parts or all of their thesis. So I have known that to happen. And so I had to do some changes, and it was just nitpicky. And it was so funny because when you said that people didn't read your thesis, both of mine had read the entire things. They had tabs on the various pages, and my exam was basically going through page by page and then them asking me the relevant questions that they'd come up with on that page. I answered them, and then we kept going. So they definitely
very different.
They definitely get it. Because there were notes, and like sometimes they'd be like, "We just don't like the way you wrote this." Then there'd be a note. And so I got basically a list of the things that they wanted corrected, and it was so nitpicky. It was because my thesis was on DNA repair. So obviously, one of the first publications that I referenced was Watson and Crick, right? Except I'd only put in like one initial, and they wanted all 4. So it was great. It was great. And so I had to change them, and then I had to email per chapter to my internal exam, surprise, my internal, so he could check that I had corrected it, and then I was allowed to print it out for the final copy. And he checked every single one.
Yeah, I think it totally it's so variable. And I think too, part of it is like the PI that I worked with, that was not something that they personally thought was as valuable to like comb through. Like they cared much more about doing that with publications than your dissertation. And especially since the way that ours worked was essentially you putting all of your publications just kind of like in the middle of your dissertation. A lot of that they probably already looked through with the fine-tooth comb. But yeah, no, I think that's kind of interesting, just how wide a variety there can be in terms of the scrutiny.
Yeah, because my publications were at the end. So they
Yeah.
were like, we had to read them to get to the publications.
Mm.
And then how about, were publications required? Because they weren't required. And I don't think they're required in the UK, because obviously you may or may not be lucky enough to get a publication if you're, depending on how your research pans out.
Yeah. And at my particular program, it was required that you had a first author publication to defend. You had to have at least one, you had to be the first author, and it had to be published. And I think that is one of the reasons too for that extended timeline, because like you said, like so often research fails. You do not have positive data that most publications, like journals, are going to want to publish.
Mhm.
So it can take a lot more time to just actually create some sort of a story that's going to eventually get published. But yeah, it was a requirement. But to be fair, again, like it's so variable, because like even within kind of the different departments that kind of made up overall, like all the biomedical sciences at UVA, like one did not have the requirement, mine did. And so again, it's just kind of like all over the place in terms of what the requirements are.
Yeah, I think it's a bit harsh, because especially nowadays, it can take such a long time for your paper to get reviewed by a journal. And then they might want changes, or they might just, reject it. And then you've got to do that process again. Like if you needed that to graduate, you could be spending so many more years just waiting for that paper to get approved and to go through.
And I know people who have waited years to basically to get a paper published.
That just doesn't seem right to me, because you're still making $30,000. You're not getting, you don't get paid postdoc salary because you've practically done, is it what, ABD, all but dissertation is what everyone says. So you're like waiting, and you're like, this paper is hopefully going to be coming through. That just seems really unnecessary to me, because you've done the work. I mean, I can kind of see both ways, and I know that at one time I should have looked into it. I want to say if you graduate with a PhD from a Scandinavian country, you have to have multiple first author papers. It's not just one.
Yeah, I had not heard that. That sounds extra brutal. But
Yeah.
I agree with a lot of your points. I just think that, especially because, grad students don't make a ton of money, it is part of the steps towards getting to kind of like ultimately kind of where you want to be in your career. To kind of basically stall it out in this one spot for things that sometimes are not within your control. Like you can't control if everything's going to work out and your paper's going to get published. If it was that easy, then maybe that's fine to make it a requirement. But I think that it can definitely stall things and make it take a lot longer than is necessary. But also, this was a struggle, and I'm curious if this also was the case in the UK. But I also knew some people who had their kind of graduations stalled because their PI wanted to publish in a really high impact journal. And even though the student was like, we could totally get this accepted if we just knock it down, by the impact factor a little bit. They kind of had to stay around and do extra work so that they could hopefully get into these higher impact journals. And that's another thing too that makes it tricky, is when you can't even decide exactly where it's going, and that having to spend more time. But was that kind of also the case too in the UK?
I think it is a case. I think the problem is because you have a committee in America, so you're getting annual meetings.
Yeah, I think some places do every 6 months now, but yeah.
Yeah, so you're getting regular meetings with your committee. They know how your research is going. You can go to them for advice, especially if you're having issues with your professor. So whether it's where you publish, or I know some instances where the professor, now that you're really well trained and you're doing your research really well, they don't want you to graduate. They're now like, if I get at least another year or two out of you, like where you're basically a postdoc but being paid as a graduate student, they save money, but they get great research out of you. And so I've known graduate students who've had to leverage their committee for their committee to say, this isn't right. They're ready to graduate. You need to allow them to move forward. And whether that's then involved going to the administration to kind of push that through. That's more of an issue. Whereas in the UK, you don't have a committee. You just have your professor. Like if something came up, I guess you could go to your department head. But but whether they can really do anything because they're not part of the training.
Yeah.
I guess you could try and go to someone on the educational side and say, this is holding me up. Especially because once you're out of money in the UK, like your funding's gone, because the funding is usually for 3 years with the possibility of like a fourth year extension. There isn't a 5, 6, 7. Like if you run out of money, you're literally expected to still pay tuition, because obviously there's no more waivers for you. They're not paying for it. So I had a friend who had to continue paying their tuition, but they weren't getting paid by the place whilst they figured out what was going on with their PhD.
Wow.
So the student is getting penalized because the professor isn't allowing them to move forward.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you have a committee. I think that puts the graduate student in a much stronger position. And that's one of the things that I really appreciated when I moved here and saw the strength of the committee, because obviously, the committee's advising you for years, so they might suggest other experiments or come up with other ideas that your professor or you haven't even considered. I think the committee is a really important part.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, that you guys don't have committees. And I do think they are super valuable. I think that sometimes what people maybe always don't factor in is just the politics of science and the fact that, at the end of the day, your committee is going to be working with your PI for hopefully ever. And sometimes that does create strife and just that, what maybe even is best for the grad student. If the PI is really against it, is everyone like on your committee going to fight the PI on it? Maybe not. But I do think it's at least nice to have people throughout the process that you get to know, they get to know you, they get to know your project, they get to weigh in and provide insight. And I think that is incredibly valuable.
Did you get to pick your committee? Because I know that depending on the PI, sometimes they're like, okay, these are my buddies, these should be on your committee. Or some other people have been like, no, you choose. But that creates some issues, because what happens if you don't want the people that they've selected? Or not necessarily suggested, maybe.
Exactly. And at least for me, it was kind of like a mix of both. There were certain people where he's like, these people should be on the committee. Like they just should be. But he's like, yeah, but you can pick out who else you want to kind of fill it out. I think for my committee, I think it's five members total. So also what that looks like total.
And then an external, or 5 including the external?
So at my institution, there was no external required. There was essentially someone outside of your department. There had to be one person that was not in the same department as you.
Oh, okay.
But they didn't have to be from a different university. So all of mine were at the same institution. Just one of them was in biomedical engineering. So that made it different enough. And yeah, then essentially there was a couple that were like, you should have them on your committee. Then I selected the rest. And then they all had some sort of roles. There were, I think, 3 different roles I had to assign. So one of them was the chair of my committee, and they're kind of person that just helps organize everything. They're the ones that I guess also directly communicate with me and my PI and figure out how things are going. And then I think there was someone who needed to be in charge of kind of the scientific rigor of my project. I think they had to sign off on certain things. So yeah, they have I think that it totally depends on the institution you're at, the department, the school, again, pretty much everything I've said, but that's how mine worked.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of, I think I might have heard of a chair of a committee, but never the rigor. I kind of like that.
Yeah.
As the person who used to teach responsible conduct of research, I appreciate that.
Yeah, honestly though, there are some very valuable parts about having kind of these different roles within a committee, and then also just a committee overall. So it was a good idea.
Weird question. Did you used to give your committee food and drink whilst you were meeting?
Yeah. So for the first year or 2 I was in grad school, this was the unspoken rule. It's you bring coffee and you bring some sort of, snacks for any of your especially big qualifying exams and things like that, but also any committee meetings. And then I think my second year, they actually sent out an email to everybody in the college, basically the whole school, and was like, we are not going to ask grad students to do this anymore. Like, this is not an expectation. You're obviously welcome to keep doing it if you want, but this is not an expectation that we have of you. Like, please don't waste your money on this, basically.
I love and appreciate that fact, because there wasn't a written rule in my graduate school, but everybody knew that if you wanted a better committee meeting, that you ought to provide coffee and pastries. And there's a famous bakery with numerous locations around the LA area called Porto's. And, you know, you would see students coming in with Starbucks coffee and very noticeable Porto's boxes. And you just think, and I was just appalled, because I'm like, oh my gosh, these professors are literally doing their service requirement right now. It's part of their job requirement. And yet the students feel that they need to spend quite a lot of money on these things to kind of make sure their committee meeting goes on. And it was so disheartening, because it's just like, you shouldn't have to do that. Like, they should just be happy that they're helping you in your career. And it used to really frustrate me, because I'm like, you know, these boxes of pastries are coming in, and you know that they've spent, you know, maybe $50 or more, and you don't get paid a lot, as we've discussed. And it would traumatize me on so many different levels, that because I'd be like, what would happen if you didn't give them that? Like, would they literally make your life worse?
Which would be awful if they did. But yeah, I honestly was really happy to, just especially as a newer grad student, you know, you're like, I want to make everybody happy and like make sure everybody is, you know, like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, because I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. It's always nice to kind of have some confirmation from kind of more administrators being like, you don't have to do this. And I think I still did. I still would buy like at least like some bagels or like some like a coffee thing. But also, like, it didn't feel like a stretch to me, and it was something I was like wanting to do, instead of feeling like this is like a rule, like we have to.
Yeah, I think the only time, so for my first meeting with my internal, obviously 0 food. It was an hour. I didn't even consider taking in anything. And then for my actual defense, it was after lunch. So didn't take anything in. But I know from other friends' experiences, if their Viva was in the morning, because I know people who've had like 6-hour Vivas, because I get page by page, right? So it depends on how long you go. I was lucky, mine was only 90 minutes. But I know people who've literally, they've sent out for lunch, like they're not finished. So they've asked the department to provide lunch and drinks for everyone. And then the exam continues whilst everyone's, which I can't imagine, because you can't really eat and answer questions.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the examiners are all eating. And the poor person who's doing their Viva is like trying to have the odd bite.
Bites between their words.
Yes, I think Vivas can definitely go a lot longer than a defense in America.
Yeah, especially because most of the time you need your whole committee to attend. And so to get 5 PIs basically like in the same place at the same time without another commitment, you don't have that much time. You just don't.
Yeah. So I guess there's pros and cons of the committee.
Yeah.
I don't know how I would have felt if I had one, because I really didn't have any issue with my PI. He was really awesome. In fact, he was the reason why I could write up so quickly, because in my first year, he had me writing little documents on all of the different proteins and things that I needed to. And then at the end, he was like, and that's your introduction.
Yeah,
and
staple that together.
And you just need to add, you know, the new details as they come in. But realistically, your introduction is written. And then all of my friends were like, how did you do that? And it's like, well, remember when you were laughing at my assignments? Well, those are my introduction.
Yeah, exactly. That's great, honestly.
He was a clever guy. Okay, and then when you finished, because I have a copy of my thesis in the British Library, so when we had to get the final product bound, one of them was to go into like my university library, one was to the British Library, and then, you know, your PI, and then family members. So did one of your copies go somewhere fancy?
Honestly, no. They had an electronic database essentially where everyone submits their thesis. And if you want, you can get it printed and like bound and put in a book and things like that. But nobody's requesting that. You can obviously do it just for yourself if you want to. But other than that, it just kind of lives in this electronic database at UVA.
Did you print it out?
No, we didn't print it out. I think that was something too that was more relatively new. I think because they were also just like these giant documents that nobody's looking at or getting like all kind of like printed out.
It's looking at.
That is impressive. See, I feel like the thing too is just like, would I even go back and look at this thing? No. And also, if I wanted to do it, especially from a scientific standpoint, I feel like it would be nice to have it in a digital format so I could like Command F my way through it. So I think that they were just like the cost of it and like kind of all those components aren't something we're gonna like require, but you can if you want to.
Yeah, I don't even know if I have an electronic copy of mine, but bearing in mind, I submitted in 2004. So 21 years later. I don't think so.
Yeah, this was also 2023. So we're like also post-COVID. I feel like too, COVID kind of just made things a little different. It was harder for things to even be in person. Like even my dissertation defense, I kind of like requested that there not be a Zoom option, but most things still had Zoom options, and like things were not as, I think it was definitely moving in a much more digital format, everything, even meetings and things like that. So
I wonder what happened, because I remember my professor had like a rack of dissertations behind him, and he'd be like, all of these are like my students. So I guess that's kind of sad if that doesn't happen anymore, because I would just go and take a book, and because I know when I wrote my acknowledgements section, which was the hardest section to write, I had a bunch of different versions in front of me from other people, and I can like, oh, I like the way they said that, and like just kind of pinch different things. But if it's digital, you can't really do that as easily, because how did you see digital copies from other people?
I did. So yeah, when I was writing mine, just to get a sense too of like format or how people kind of did some of their sections and things, I looked through some of the digital like theses.
Okay, so that is a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you still could, it's still kind of all accessible and you can see things and read them if you want, but yeah, it's not as satisfying. Probably it's like holding a book that someone like really poured themselves into, I feel like you lose a little of that when it's just online.
Yeah, I remember handing my mum a copy and her going, okay, dear, and putting it on the table. And I think she might have looked at the acknowledgements just to make sure she's in there. But I very much doubt she has got to like page 1 where we talk about what DNA is.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess there are 20 years in between your submission and mine. So
but that's like the thing again is like things are so different. I heard of another program kind of at the like a different institution, and they were super specific. First of all, you had to pay actually to get your thesis basically like published. And then you had it to have incredibly impeccable formatting. If things were not like the margins weren't correct and like everything wasn't properly like sectioned off using the correct Roman numerals and like all these different things, they would not accept your thesis, and that could even delay people from walking for graduation. So like I think it's like there's so much variety in how some of these institutions kind of prioritize things and how they want to do it.
Sounds like my internal examiner.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure if I had messed anything up, he would have sent me back, because we did have very strict requirements.
Yeah.
And like all of my images had to be on their own page, and then with I had to have a table of figures and a table of yeah. It was super fun.
I feel kind of fortunate that ours was not so nitpicky. But I mean, also, I feel like you get some like a really beautiful product at the end of it. Ours was kind of basically just a big giant PDF of everything all together.
Yeah, I don't know. It is what it is. But I think there's definitely pros and cons to the different ways of doing it. It is quite nice to be able to just whip it out whenever I want and be like, ta-da, I've written a book.
Yes.
Okay, so if you could do it again and you had the option of doing it in the UK versus America, would you still choose America?
This is a good question. I think what's tricky is all the things we don't talk about in this video, right? Just like family, friends, cultural differences, if there are any, just like the things that I feel like are not just the numbers and facts and figures that make it feel like I would probably do one in the US still. But I think what is really cool about going abroad and I think just like getting to experience other areas of the world, getting to also like I think have a shorter duration of your PhD sounds great. Like it sounds like there's a lot of perks for being able to do it in the UK. But I think I might still pick the US, but probably more so for all the reasons that were not ones we talked about today. What about you? Would you still do your PhD in the
See, this is the thing. I was an associate dean for years, so I kind of enjoy the American system. I think I'd have been frustrated if I needed to repeat the classes. I mean, the English students that I've seen were just pulling their hair out, and I couldn't do anything about it. So for that reason, I would probably still do the UK version. But I will admit that because you do rotations and you usually have longer to research, that the American or the people who do the American PhD usually would have more research experience by the time they graduate, which I think is important. It's only because I did my year at VCU, got it right that time, that I had 4 years of research going into my postdoc. Because I did see a difference between the people who'd gone through the American system versus the people who'd gone through the British, and some of the European systems are longer.
Okay.
So I think there is a little bit of a difference. But no, I enjoyed mine. Luckily, I didn't have any issues. But I can see if someone did have issues with the professor, the American system is better in that way. I feel like you're more protected.
Yeah, and there definitely are some extra safeguards there that are nice. But I think that there's like a lot about the UK system that makes a lot of sense. Like not repeating all these courses, actually training people maybe for the beginning for what they actually want to do ultimately as a career. Having to be a shorter time frame, especially since you're making less money. So yeah, I think there's definitely pros and cons on both sides.
Okay. Do you think that's everything we want to cover? I think so, right?
So. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for joining me today, Shayla. It's been a pleasure. We're going to do a couple of these videos on a variety of different things. We haven't touched Shayla's expertise yet, so wait for the video that's coming on project management. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Yes, thanks for having me. Bye.